So here we are, Chapter 6, and we're picking it up with crime statistics. Now, we talked about the Uniform Crime Report, which is put together by the FBI, but we also talked about how people had, well, reservations about how it was put together. In fact, you probably heard things like, we believe that rapes are underreported. You ever wonder, like, well, how would they know? Well, there's another gathering of statistics called the National Crime Victimization Survey. And this was put together by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And this asks people from the general population, have you been the victim of a crime? And this is where we start getting some of that information about people underreporting certain kinds of crime. The book discusses terrorism and crime, which would be very cautious with the term terrorism. Remember, one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. All the people that are on our money, our American Revolutionary heroes, were called terrorists by the English government. They use the term sedition, but it was the same idea. Street crime. When we talk about crime, generally we're talking about street crime and not white-collar crime, even though, again, as a sociologist, I have to say again, white-collar crime is kind of more interesting. Why do rich people who don't need it continue to commit crime? It's actually more understandable if you're poor and you commit crime because you're trying to get more of what you don't have. So what do we learn? Most crime, again, committed by men, though women are moving up, not, as we thought in the 70s and 80s, into violent crime or female super predators, but drug muling, financial crimes, and that kind of thing. Age, generally crime is a young person's game. We tend to age out of criminal activity by about 37 years old. Class, we know that all different classes commit crime, but we obviously have a police force and a judicial system focused on catching street or lower class crime. We also know that they tend to victimize in their class. Poor people tend to rob poor people. Rich people tend to rob rich people and middle class people. Race and crime, again, we find that disproportionately number of African Americans are in jail, yet arrest rates are more even, still more African Americans being arrested than their occurrence in the population, which lets us speculate about the racism of things like police enforcement of criminal activity and who we stop and who we ask and who we frisk and that sort of thing. There's a term called victimization that I want you to make yourself familiar with. This actually tends to make some people very upset. You participate in your own criminal victimization. People get upset when they hear that, but it's the truth. The fact is that if you're at home at 4 o'clock on a Friday night, you're probably not going to get into a drunken brawl or get your purse stolen or any of that kind of stuff. Let's take a look at the criminal justice system. The police, which of course is getting a lot of focus right now in the news with Mr. Floyd's death. But there's other issues of racial profiling that police teach fellow police officers to identify who are criminals. And we thought this would be made better when we had African American and Hispanic people joining the force. But what we're finding is that once they're exposed to the training and standard of fellow police officers, they get behind what's called the blue line, which is being loyal to not the law or the Constitution or justice, but to fellow police officers, that they learn who the bad people are. The courts, most crime that we arrest somebody for is pled out, never actually sees a courtroom. But here's where we enter some other troubling issues. One is mandatory sentencing. There's been a movement to try to reassess that. This was a big movement back in the 90s. You got to have mandatory sentences, can't trust judges. And so people were being put in jail for particularly like drug crimes for smaller and smaller amounts of drug possession. We also are finding out, of course, who are most judges. Most judges are rich, older, white men. So they don't see people of color or people of the lower classes as being like themselves. And that's problematic. One of the things that came up recently that I wasn't even aware of, the number of district attorneys that are white and male, even more so than judges. And that's important because it's your district attorney who decides, who am I going to take forward? Who am I going to accept a plea from? Who am I going to offer a plea from? And again, if I'm white and I'm male and I'm rich and I'm over the age of 50 something, then young people of color are not going to be people I think of like myself. And maybe I'm going to be hard on them, particularly if I have to run for office. Juvenile courts, this is a problem because juvenile court system operates on a much different standard. Some places it's called in loco parenti, in place of the parent. So there, judges are given a great deal of latitude. You go, oh, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the fact is that if I'm introduced to the criminal justice system early on, then the police and everybody in that local area knows who I am as being somebody who's been picked up or arrested. Now, people will say, oh, well, but your record is expunged or whatever. That's not true. Actually, your record isn't expunged. All your arrests pop up on that screen when an officer runs who you are. So you have to get your court record if you have a juvenile set of offenses sealed. That isn't done automatically. Then there's a discussion of punishment, what we call penology. Four major sort of themes or goals. One is retribution, being straight up, we're getting you back for doing something bad. Deterrence, the idea of, well, this is coming, so you won't do a bad thing. Incapacitation, you can't commit more crime while you're locked up. And then rehabilitation, the idea that I'm going to train you differently. Well, over the past 25, 30 years, it seems that we've given up rehabilitation almost completely. Incapacitation does somewhat work. You're going to commit fewer street crimes if you're not out on the street. But deterrence, we're seeing less and less of that being an operative factor. In Texas, I want you to be aware of a term called the tunnel. The tunnel is what we refer to the Texas Department of Corrections. There's about 40,000 people in that system. It's called the tunnel because there's 40,000 people in the system. If I put 5,000 in this end, 5,000 has to come out that end. Why is that important? Well, with mandatory sentences, keeping, let's say, 25% of the jail population for nonviolent first-time drug offenders, let's say in the state of Texas, then I'm going to have to parole that 5,000 that comes out this end. I have to parole somebody, and we're actually paroling more and more violent criminals because they don't have mandatory sentences. Then there's a discussion of the death penalty. A lot of discussion about that, particularly when we look at the race of inmates for the death penalty. 44% of people on death row are African American. Remember, they're 14% of the population. Clearly something is going on there. 98% are male. Only 2% are female on death row. The other thing is people talk about, oh, it's the race of the accused perpetrator that's the issue. For the death penalty, actually, I want you to remember this. It's the race of the victim that we find to be most determining. Somebody kills a black person, they're probably not going to get the death penalty. Somebody kills a white person, they're much more likely to get the death penalty, even if they're white, but particularly if they're a person of color. So put that away. I also want you to keep track of Furman v. Georgia, that made death penalty before 1972. They commuted all those sentences, and then by 76, a bunch of states, Texas included, wanted to start having the death penalty again, and enthusiastically the state of Texas joined in. All right, so that's the end of Chapter 6, and good luck on the test.